The most dangerous day in human history did not arrive with sirens. It arrived as heat. Deep beneath the surface of the Sargasso Sea, on the afternoon of October the 27th, 1962, a Soviet submarine hung in the black too. A Soviet submarine hung in the black water like a sealed iron coffin. Her name was B-59. Inside her hull, the air had turned foul. In the living compartments, the temperature had climbed toward 50 degrees Celsius, and in the engine rooms, by the crew's own accounts, it pushed higher still, past 60. The men had stripped to their underwear. They moved slowly when they moved at all. Some had fainted where they stood. Carbon dioxide was thickening the air, and every breath came shallower than the last. Sweat did not drip. It clung. And through the steel, from the bright world above that they could no longer see, came a sound that would not stop. A hard metallic hammering. Explosion after explosion walking closer through the sea. The crew believed the war had already begun. They had no way to know that it had not. And in that overheated darkness, 3 officers were about to have an argument that would decide whether the 20th century ended in 1962. Here is the strange part, the part almost no one on Earth would learn for the next 40 years. The man who won that argument was not the captain. He was not the loudest voice in the room. He was a quiet officer who happened to be aboard the wrong submarine at the right moment. His name was Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov, and the most important thing he ever did was refuse. If the hidden machinery of the Cold War draws you in, the near misses, the secret orders, the men history almost forgot, then consider subscribing to the channel. We rebuild these declassified moments from the ground up, tracing how close the world came to the edge and how thin the line between memory and catastrophe truly was. Because to understand what happened inside that submarine, you first have to understand the enormous machine that put it there and the contradiction buried at the very heart of that machine. The Soviet armed forces were built on a single idea. The individual did not matter. Doctrine mattered. The chain of command mattered. A sailor, an officer, each was a component in a larger mechanism, trained to answer an order the way a gear answers a turning shaft. The system was designed deliberately to remove personal judgment from the equation. Personal judgment was unreliable. It could hesitate. It could panic. It could dream. What the state wanted was predictability. It wanted men who would do exactly what they were trained to do, exactly when they were told, without the interference of their own conscience. And yet here is the paradox that sits at the center of this entire story. On October the 27th, 1962, the fate of that rigid, obedient system and the fate of hundreds of millions of people came down to one officer choosing to trust his own judgment over his orders. A machine built to guarantee obedience was saved in the end by a single man's refusal to obey. To see how that impossible situation came to be, we have to go back to the beginning, to a decision made in Moscow that almost no one in the West even knew about. In the autumn of 1962, the Soviet Union was pouring men and weapons into Cuba under a vast secret program named Anadyr. Most people remember the missiles, the launch sites photographed from the air, the crated warheads, and the standoff over the island. But there was a naval component to Anadyr that stayed hidden for decades, and it carried a code name of its own. It was called Operation Karma. 4 submarines were chosen from the Northern Fleet. They were diesel-electric boats of the Project 641 type, known to NATO as the Foxtrot class. Their hull numbers were B4, B36, B59, and B130. On the 1st of October 1962, they slipped out of a bay on the Kola Peninsula in the frozen far north of Russia, leaving at half-hour intervals under cover of darkness, and turned south toward the Caribbean. Their destination was the Cuban port of Mariel. Their mission was to plant a permanent Soviet submarine presence in American waters, right on the doorstep of the United States. The gamble behind all of this was enormous. The Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, had looked at the map of the world and seen a country that felt surrounded. American nuclear missiles sat in Turkey and Italy within easy reach of Soviet cities, while the Soviet Union had no comparable way to threaten the American mainland from close range. Placing missiles in Cuba, only 90 miles from the coast of Florida, was meant to close that gap in a single stroke. Operation Anadyr was the machinery of that gamble, and it was vast. Tens of thousands of Soviet troops, along with aircraft, missiles, and warheads, were shipped in secret across the Atlantic. Disguised as ordinary cargo, the men themselves told they were bound for a cold climate and handed winter gear to sell the deception. The 4 submarines were the sharp edge of that hidden armada, sent to guard the sea approaches to the island and to carry the Soviet flag and its most terrible weapon into waters the United States considered its own. It was an act of extraordinary boldness, and it rested on one fragile assumption that the whole enterprise could be kept secret until it was too late for the Americans to undo it. That assumption shattered when an American spy plane photographed the missile sites under construction, and the most dangerous confrontation of the nuclear age began. And each of those 4 submarines carried a secret in her torpedo room. Alongside the ordinary torpedoes sat one weapon that was not ordinary at all. It was a T-5 torpedo, tipped with a nuclear warhead. Estimates of its power vary across the sources, from a few kilotons to 15, but the figure most often cited places it near 10 kilotons, which is to say, roughly the force of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. Each of these small diesel boats carried, in a single tube, enough destructive power to erase a fleet from the surface of the ocean. The crews had been briefed on when they might use it. If the submarine were attacked and her hull were breached, or if a direct order came from Moscow, the captain could consider releasing that weapon. But here is the detail that would matter more than any other. The explicit order to fire was never sent. The decision, if it ever came, would be made not in a Kremlin war room, but in the cramped control compartment of a submarine thousands of miles from home, by exhausted men who could barely breathe. There is a haunting ambiguity in the orders those captains carried, and it goes to the very heart of how close disaster really was. The commanders had been briefed before departure on the circumstances in which the special weapon might be used, but the instructions were not a model of clarity, and they had been given by word of mouth in the rush of a secret deployment. The captains understood that they could consider using the nuclear torpedo if their submarine were being destroyed, if the hull were breached by enemy fire, or if an order arrived from Moscow authorizing it. But the sea is a place of ambiguity, and a submarine under a rain of explosions has no clean way to know whether it is being sunk or merely signalled. What counts as an attack when you cannot see your attacker? What counts as the destruction of your boat when the hull is ringing and the lights are flickering and the air is running out? The men who wrote those orders in Moscow imagined clean, recognizable situations. The men who had to interpret them were trapped in the opposite of clarity, in a fog of noise and heat and fear where every signal could be read 2 ways. Into that gap, between the tidy language of an order and the chaos of the real thing, the fate of the world quietly slipped. It would fall to the judgment of individual, exhausted human beings to decide what their orders actually meant at the one moment when it mattered. Command of the little flotilla was split between 2 of the boats. The brigade commander, Captain First Rank Vitaly Agafonov, sailed aboard B-4, and aboard B-59 rode a second senior officer who did not belong to that boat's own crew. He was the brigade's chief of staff, Vasily Arkhipov. The captain of B-59 was a man named Valentin Savitsky, and by rank, Arkhipov was his equal. That fact, an accident of how the command staff had been divided among the boats, would turn out to matter more than anyone could have imagined. Because Arkhipov happened to be aboard B-59, the authority to use the nuclear torpedo on that one submarine did not rest with 2 men, as it did on the others. It rested with 3. Hold on to that. A world would balance on it. The 4 boats sailed into disaster almost at once, though not the kind anyone had planned for. These were Arctic submarines. They had been designed and built for the cold grey waters of the north, where the sea itself carries away the heat of the machinery. Now they were being driven into the tropics. As the boats crossed into warmer latitudes, the temperature inside began to rise, and it did not stop. The cooling systems, built for a different ocean, simply could not cope. For the crews, the voyage south became a slow torture long before the Americans ever found them. As the boats pressed into the tropics, the interior turned into an oven that never cooled. The steel of the hull grew hot to the touch. Machinery that had run sweetly in Arctic water now strained and overheated. Fresh water had to be rationed, and what little there was went to the batteries and the machinery before it went to the men. Some sailors developed rashes and sores from the heat and the salt. Others suffered from the thick, humid air and the lack of sleep. On a diesel submarine forced to stay hidden, there is no relief, no cool corner, and no window to open. The men lived in their own sweat, in a cramped metal world that grew more punishing with every mile they travelled south. By the time the boats reached the waters off the American coast, their crews were already worn dangerously thin, their nerves frayed, their bodies drained. This is the human condition that must be kept in mind through everything that followed. The men who would soon face the most consequential decision of the century were not fresh, rested professionals acting from a place of calm. They were sick, overheated, sleep-starved sailors who had already been suffering for weeks, pushed close to the edge of what a human body can bear before the real crisis even began. And the Foxtrots carried another cruel limitation. A diesel-electric submarine can only run submerged for so long. Its motors draw on great banks of batteries, and those batteries drain. To recharge them, the boat has to come near the surface, raise a breathing tube called a snorkel, and run her noisy diesel engines, gulping air. To receive any orders from home, she has to come shallow enough to lift a radio antenna above the waves. A submerged Foxtrot is blind, deaf, and running against a clock. That was the machine these men were asked to hide in the most heavily patrolled ocean on the planet at the most dangerous moment of the century. So how does a fleet of superpower warships find 4 small submarines in the vastness of the Atlantic? And what happens to the men inside when they are found? The answer is that the United States Navy had spent years preparing for exactly this hunt. By the early 1960s, the Americans had strung a listening system across the floor of the ocean, a network of underwater microphones that could catch the sound of a submarine's engines across great distances. When the Soviet boats rose to snorkel and charge their batteries, they made noise, and that noise was heard. Once a rough position was known, the Navy sent its hunters. Anti-submarine aircraft and packs of destroyers trailing sonar gear converged on the contacts. The scale of the force arrayed against these 4 small boats is difficult to overstate. To enforce the quarantine and to sweep the approaches to Cuba, the United States assembled one of the largest anti-submarine operations ever mounted. Aircraft carriers given over entirely to hunting submarines, screens of destroyers, patrol planes flying from bases up and down the eastern seaboard, and the listening arrays on the ocean floor all worked together to build a moving wall across the sea. A single diesel submarine, forced to surface every day or two to breathe and to charge, was terribly exposed against such a net. Once the Americans had a boat's rough position, they could steer aircraft and ships onto it and simply wait for it to run out of battery and air. The Soviet captains understood the odds against them. They had been sent, in effect, to hide 4 slow, short-winded boats in the middle of the enemy's own hunting ground, under orders to remain undetected, and with no realistic way to fight back if they were found. It was a mission built on a hope that reality had no intention of honouring. The first of the 4 to be run down was B-130, the boat commanded by Nikolai Shumkov. She suffered a mechanical catastrophe. One after another, all 3 of her diesel engines failed. With her batteries drained and no way to recharge them, she was left almost helpless, forced to the surface with American ships closing in. She could not run. In the end, she had to be taken under tow by a Soviet tug and dragged the long way home across the Atlantic, a humiliating voyage of weeks. Shumkov, by his own later account, ordered his nuclear torpedo made ready during his ordeal, in part to show his resolve, but his political officer objected and Shumkov let the matter drop, remarking grimly that if they fired it while trapped on the surface, they would only go up along with the enemy. The second boat to be cornered was B-36, under Captain Alexei Dubivko. She was picked up by an American destroyer named the Charles P. Cecil, and what followed was a slow, grinding contest of endurance. The destroyer clung to her for the better part of a day and a half, hour after hour, while B-36 twisted through the depths trying to shake her off. She released decoys. She changed course and speed. Nothing worked. After roughly 35 hours submerged, her batteries finally gave out, and her air grew unbreathable, and at the end of October, she too was forced to the surface in front of her pursuer. Only one of the 4, B-4, the boat carrying the brigade commander, managed to slip the net. She was spotted by patrol aircraft, but she held enough charge in her batteries to stay down long enough to escape the search area, and she made it away clean. 3 of the 4 boats sent to menace the American coast were dragged into the daylight and photographed. It was, by the standards of the men who had planned the operation, a disaster. And the worst of those three encounters, the one that came closest to ending the world, was still unfolding around B-59. To understand why the men aboard B-59 were so ready to believe the worst, you have to understand who Vasily Artypov was and what he already knew about the true nature of catastrophe. Because just 1 year earlier, Artypov had stood at the center of a nuclear disaster and had watched it kill the men around him. In July of 1961, he had been the deputy commander of a brand new Soviet submarine, a nuclear-powered vessel designated K-19. She was the first of her kind in the Soviet fleet, a boat built to carry nuclear missiles beneath the sea. On the 4th of July that year in the North Atlantic, K-19 suffered a catastrophic failure in one of her reactors. A pipe in the cooling system ruptured, the pressure fell away to nothing, and without coolant the reactor began to overheat, climbing toward temperatures that could melt the core and release a flood of radiation. There was no backup cooling system. The radio that might have called for help had failed, so the crew built a solution with their own hands. A team of engineers went into the reactor compartment, into a storm of invisible radiation, wearing little more than raincoats and gas masks, and welded together a makeshift line to pump water onto the dying reactor. They saved the submarine. It cost them their lives. The men who made that repair sickened within hours and died within days and weeks, in agony, their bodies destroyed by the doses they had absorbed. In the 2 years that followed, more of the crew would die of the same cause, until the toll reached somewhere near 22 men. The rest of the crew, Artypov among them, carried significant doses out of that accident in their own flesh. The survivors gave the boat a bitter nickname. They did not call her a hero ship. They called her Hiroshima. The full horror of what those men prevented aboard K-19 is worth pausing on, because it shaped everything Artypov would come to understand about the weapons he served. Had the reactor melted down, it would not have produced a nuclear explosion the way a bomb does, but it could have released a catastrophic flood of radiation that would have destroyed the submarine and everyone aboard, and there were fears it might have touched off the conventional weapons or been read by the West as a deliberate act. The boat was operating not far from waters watched closely by NATO forces. A Soviet nuclear vessel dying in a spreading cloud of radiation, in the poisoned atmosphere of the Cold War, was exactly the kind of accident that could spiral into something far larger than one lost submarine. The men who went into that reactor compartment understood, at least in part, that they were not only saving their shipmates but containing a disaster whose true edges no one could see. Artypov had lived inside that knowledge. He had felt in his own body how a single mechanical failure in the wrong place at the wrong moment could put not just a crew, but the fragile piece itself at risk. A year later, in the heat of B-59, that lesson would be the quiet foundation beneath everything he did. Artypov lived through K-19. He absorbed a measure of radiation that many believe contributed to his death many years later. But he carried something else out of that reactor compartment, something no instrument could read. He had seen with his own eyes exactly what nuclear energy does to the human body. He had watched calm, competent men volunteer to die so that the rest might live. He knew, in a way the planners in Moscow never could, that a nuclear weapon was not an abstraction on a map, and the men who served with him knew that he knew. His authority did not come from volume or from swagger. It came from the plain fact that Vasily Artypov had already looked into the worst thing imaginable and had not lost his composure. When a man like that speaks quietly, other men listen. That quality was about to matter more than anyone could have guessed. Now gather all of it together inside that hull on the afternoon they would later call Black Saturday. The heat that would not break. The air slowly turning to poison. The batteries dying. The hammering of the charges against the plating. And, worst of all, the silence from Moscow. B-59 had been unable to raise her radio for days. She could not tell her superiors where she was. She could not ask for orders. She could not receive them. The officers had no idea what was happening in the wider world. For all they knew, the standoff over Cuba had already tipped into open war. For all they knew, their cities were burning and their homeland was already under attack. In the absence of information, the human mind fills the emptiness with its fears. And the fear inside B-59, entirely understandable given everything the crew was living through, was that the Third World War had already begun, and that their submarine was under direct and deadly assault. The isolation of the boat in those hours is hard to picture from the surface world, where information flows without effort. A submerged submarine of that era was, for most purposes, sealed off from the rest of the human race. To hear anything from Moscow, B-59 had to rise close enough to the surface to lift an antenna into the air, and every time she tried, the American ships and planes were waiting to force her back down. The relentless pursuit had cost her even that thin thread. Earlier in the voyage, the crew had sometimes been able to pick up ordinary civilian radio broadcasts from the United States, catching scraps of news and music from the very country they had been sent to watch. Now, pinned in the deep, they could catch nothing at all. They did not know whether negotiations were still going on or had collapsed. They did not know whether the missiles in Cuba still sat in their sights or had already been launched. They did not know whether the ships hunting them were enforcing a blockade or fighting a war that had already started. Into that total silence, the human imagination poured its darkest guesses, and the hammering of the charges against the hull seemed to confirm every one of them. That fear was not foolish, because on the surface of the world that same day, events really were sliding toward the edge, and if the submariners could have seen the sky above them, they would have found little comfort in it. October 27th, 1962 is the day history remembers as Black Saturday, and it was the single worst day of the entire crisis. That morning, over Cuba, an American reconnaissance aircraft flying at the edge of the atmosphere was struck by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson, was killed when shrapnel tore open his pressure suit at altitude. He would be the only man to die in combat during the whole confrontation. The order to fire that missile had not come from Moscow. It had been given by Soviet commanders on the ground in Cuba, acting on their own initiative, and news of it frightened the leaders of both superpowers, precisely because it suggested that events were beginning to escape the control of the men who were supposed to be in charge, and that was not the only aircraft in trouble that day. Far to the north, another American reconnaissance plane flying a sampling mission toward the North Pole drifted badly off course. Its pilot, Major Charles Maltsby, was navigating by the stars, and when the shifting light of the aurora blotted out his guide stars, he strayed across the line into Soviet airspace over the far eastern tip of the Soviet Union. Soviet fighters scrambled to bring him down. In answer, American interceptors lifted off to escort him home, and under the extraordinary alert conditions of that week, some of those American jets carried nuclear-tipped air-to-air missiles, weapons that individual pilots had the technical means to launch on their own authority. A lost man in a fragile aircraft wandering over the wrong country had pulled armed fighters from two nations into the same patch of Arctic sky. He was talked back across the line and landed with his fuel all but gone. When the president later heard the story, he is said to have remarked that there was always some fool who did not get the word. Above all of it hung the posture of the American nuclear force itself. Days earlier, the Strategic Air Command had been raised to a state of readiness one single step below all-out nuclear war. The only time in the Cold War it went to that level across the whole force. Bombers stood loaded on runways and circled in the air around the clock. Land-based missiles waited in their silos. In Washington, the president and his closest advisors met almost without pause, weighing every move against the terror of the one move that could not be taken back. Behind the scenes, a fragile bargain was taking shape. On the evening of that very Saturday, the president's brother met privately with the Soviet ambassador and passed along a quiet promise. The United States would pledge not to invade Cuba, and it would secretly remove its own nuclear missiles from Turkey within a matter of months, provided the arrangement was never made public. That hidden understanding, more than any grand speech, was what would eventually pull the world back from the brink. But none of it had been settled yet, and absolutely none of it could be known by the men suffocating inside B-59. Their instinct that the world was tipping over the edge was not paranoia. It was, in its way, a faithful reading of a planet holding its breath. It was in that state, worn past exhaustion, half suffocated, deafened by explosions and cut off from every source of authority, that Captain Valentin Savitsky reached his breaking point. According to the accounts that emerged from the crew long afterward, Savitsky concluded that the war had come. If the war had begun, then his duty seemed plain. He would not let his boat be destroyed without answering. He gave the order to bring the nuclear torpedo toward readiness. The most vivid description of that moment comes from Vadim Orlov, a signals officer aboard the boat, whose recollection was published by a Russian journalist decades later. By Orlov's account, the captain cried out that perhaps the war had already started up there while they turned somersaults in the deep, and that they would strike now, and die, but sink them all, and not disgrace the honour of the fleet. We should be careful with those words. They come from a single witness, recorded years after the fact, and they cannot be treated as a verbatim transcript. Arkhipov, who was actually on the conning tower, never confirmed them, and in the one public account he ever gave, he avoided the word nuclear entirely. But the essential fact is not seriously disputed. The captain of B-59, believing his country was at war and his boat was doomed, moved toward using a nuclear weapon against the United States Navy. And so we arrive at the collision that everything had been building toward, the collision between a man's orders and a man's judgment. The most obedient navy in the world was about to discover whether it could contain a single voice that said no. To feel the weight of what was about to happen, you have to understand exactly what a launch would have meant. This was not a warning shot. The T-5 torpedo carried a warhead in the range of the weapon that had leveled a Japanese city. Detonated in the middle of an American hunter-killer group, it would not merely have damaged the ships around it. It would have vaporized them. Thousands of American sailors would have died in a single flash of light in the middle of the ocean. And there is no serious version of events in which the United States, having just lost warships to a Soviet nuclear weapon at the very peak of the Cuban crisis, does not answer in kind. The retaliation would have been nuclear. The Soviet response to that retaliation would have been nuclear. The careful, terrified illusion that the two superpowers could stand at the brink without falling over it would have shattered in a single afternoon. And it would have shattered not because a president or a premier had decided to end the world, but because a handful of suffocating men in a steel tube beneath the sea had made a decision in the dark. On the other three boats, and by the ordinary practice of the fleet, the choice to use the special weapon required the agreement of two men, the captain and the political officer. Aboard B-59, the political officer was named Ivan Semyonovich Maslenikov, and by the accounts that survive, he was prepared to stand with his captain. Two men then were ready to go. Under the rules that governed the sister submarines, two would have been enough. The torpedo would have been armed, but B-59 was not an ordinary boat that day, for one reason, and one reason alone. The brigade chief of staff was aboard, and so his agreement was needed too. The decision required three, and the third man was Vasily Arkhipov. He refused. In that overheated, airless compartment, with his captain issuing the order and the political officer backing it, with the hull ringing from the charges and every instinct in the crew screaming that they were already at war, Arkhipov would not give his consent. What followed, by every account, was not a calm discussion. It was a furious argument in the worst conditions human beings can be asked to endure. Savitsky was the captain of a submarine he believed was moments from destruction, and here was an officer of equal rank telling him to hold. Voices rose. The pressure in that space was almost beyond what the mind can bear. Every minute of delay felt like a minute closer to being sunk with the weapon still in its tube. And still Arkhipov held his ground. His argument was not that they should surrender. It was not, at its core, even about courage. It was about the difference between what they knew and what they merely feared. They believed the war had started, but they did not know it. They had heard explosions, yet explosions near a submarine could mean many things, and not one of them had actually seen a shot unmistakably meant to kill. They had lost contact with Moscow, but losing contact was not the same as their country being destroyed. Arkhipov grasped something that terror had driven out of the other officers. Every fear inside that hull was a guess, and they were about to gamble the survival of the world on a guess. To fire the torpedo was to make a choice that could never be undone based on information they did not have. But there was one thing they could still do that was not irreversible. They could rise. They could surface and look with their own eyes at the world above and find out whether the thing they feared was actually true before they did something that could never be taken back. That was the reframe that changed everything. Arkhipov did not fight the argument on the ground the others had chosen, the question of whether to strike or to die. He moved the question. The real issue, he insisted, was not whether they were brave enough to launch. It was whether they actually knew what was happening up there. And the honest answer was no. So the correct action was not to fire blind. It was to go up and to see. To a navy that prized aggression and honor above almost everything, surfacing in front of the enemy felt like humiliation. Arkhipov argued that it was the only rational act left to them. Slowly, against the fury and the fear, he wore his captain down. Savitsky relented. The order toward the torpedo was set aside, and B-59 began, at last, to climb toward the light. It is worth adding, for the sake of honesty, that the boat's dying batteries and failing air were pushing her toward the surface anyway. Restraint and necessity worked in the same direction that afternoon. But it was Arkhipov who turned a moment of blind panic into a decision to look before acting, and that is the hinge on which the story turns. When she broke the surface into the clean air and the fading daylight, the crew found not the apocalypse they had braced for, but the tense, ordinary reality of a standoff that had not yet become a war. American aircraft circled overhead. Searchlights swept across the streaming hull. The destroyer Coney drew alongside and began to signal by flashing light. The Americans, it turned out, had been dropping practice charges as a signal, a crude way of ordering an unidentified submarine to surface and identify itself, though no one aboard B-59 had been given the key to read that signal, and from inside the hull it had been indistinguishable from an attack. By one account, one of the American ships even played music across the water toward the exhausted Soviet sailors. There was no invasion. There were no burning cities. The world was still intact. B-59, her batteries all but dead and her air all but gone, sat on the surface in the gathering dark, and then was allowed to turn and withdraw. The nuclear torpedo stayed in its tube. The most catastrophic weapon aboard was never used because one man had insisted on the difference between knowing and fearing. The encounter on the surface was, in its own way, as strange as the terror that had come before it. A young American officer aboard the destroyer Coney, trained to communicate with the Soviets, worked to signal the submarine with a flashing light, spelling out messages letter by letter across the dark water. The two vessels ran side by side through the night, the great grey destroyer and the battered black submarine, close enough that the men on each could make out the shapes of the men on the other. The Americans signalled that they meant no harm and asked whether the Soviets needed help. There is even an odd footnote to the standoff. The very aircraft carrier that had helped corner B-59 was itself forced to break off and turn for port because of a failure in one of her own boilers, a small mechanical breakdown on the American side, to mirror the ones that had crippled the Soviet boats. For a time the submarine was shadowed, watched and photographed, and then, as the crisis on land moved toward its resolution, she was allowed to slip away and turn for home. No shots had been fired. No one on either side had died. Two crews of frightened men had come within a single decision of destroying one another, and instead they passed in the night and let one another live. Here is a fact that ought to unsettle anyone who hears this story. When those submarines finally limped home to the Soviet Union, their crews were not welcomed as heroes. They were met with something closer to suspicion and shame. The mission had been judged a failure by the men who had planned it. The boats had been detected. 3 of the 4 had been forced to surface in front of the Americans, the very outcome the Navy considered a disgrace. There is an account that the acting defense minister, on learning that the boats sent to Cuba had been ordinary diesel submarines, rather than the nuclear fleet he had assumed, and that they had been driven to the surface, tore off his glasses and smashed them against the table in his fury. In the debriefings that followed, there was little appetite for the idea that anyone aboard had done something extraordinary. Arkhipov himself recalled a senior admiral of the Northern Fleet greeting the returning submariners with the flat, cold words that they had not even expected them to come back alive. The truth of what had almost happened in the depths of the Sargasso Sea and what Arkhipov had prevented was not celebrated. It was folded into the vast secrecy of the Soviet military machine and left there in the dark. Vasily Arkhipov did not receive a medal for helping to stop a nuclear war. He received something closer to a reprimand, and then he went back to work. The other boats and their captains carried their own scars home. B-130, her engines dead, was towed the whole long way back across the ocean, a slow and bitter passage of weeks. B-36 and B-59 limped north under their own power. Only B-4, with the brigade commander aboard, returned with her pride intact, having never once been forced to the surface. In time, some of these men were quietly rewarded rather than ruined. The commander of the brigade and the captain who had slipped the American net were later entrusted with the newest nuclear submarines the fleet possessed, a sign that their conduct had not been judged as harshly as that first cold reception suggested. The captains stayed in touch across the decades, bound together by the secret they all shared and the ordeal they had all survived. One of them, Ryurik Ketov, remained a close friend of Archipov's for the rest of his life, and it was partly through the memories of men like Ketov that the true story would one day reach the world. But for now, in the middle of the 1960s, they simply returned to their lives and their duties and said nothing. 4 crews scattered across a vast country, each man carrying in silence the knowledge of how near the whole world had come to ending on their account. He stayed in the Soviet Navy for many more years. He rose steadily through the ranks, becoming a rear admiral and later a vice admiral, and he commanded a naval academy before he retired. His life had begun far from the sea. He was born on January 30, 1926, in the countryside of the Moscow region into a peasant family, and the records differ on the exact village of his birth. He came up through the naval schools of a country at war, trained first at the Pacific Higher Naval School, and in August of 1945, as the Second World War closed, he served aboard a minesweeper in the brief, sharp campaign against Japan. He finished his education at a naval school in Baku on the Caspian Sea, graduating in 1947, and from there went into the submarine service that would define his life, serving across the Black Sea, the Northern, and the Baltic fleets. Those who knew him remembered a modest, soft-spoken man, thoughtful and steady, not the sort to seek attention. He did not go on the radio to tell the world what he had done in the autumn of 1962. For most of his life, he could not have, even had he wished to, because the whole episode lay locked behind the secrecy of 2 governments that each had reasons to keep it buried. The Soviet state did not care to admit it had sent nuclear torpedoes to the edge of American waters. The story simply did not exist in the public world. It sat in sealed archives and in the private memories of aging men, and it waited. Because a secret of that magnitude does not truly vanish. It waits for someone to open the file. The silence that swallowed the story was not only a Soviet silence. The United States had its own reasons to say little. The American Navy did not care to advertise how close its routine anti-submarine operations had come to provoking a nuclear detonation in the middle of its own fleet. The very procedures that had driven B-59 to the brink, the signalling charges meant to force a submarine up, looked very different once it was understood that the boat being signalled carried a nuclear weapon and a crew convinced they were under attack. For years, the encounter survived in American records only as a dry logbook entry about an unidentified submarine tracked and surfaced on a certain night. The full meaning of that entry, the fact that a nuclear torpedo had been readied and then held back in the depths beneath those destroyers, was something neither government had any wish to announce, and so the 2 sides, adversaries in almost everything else, cooperated without ever intending to in keeping the very same secret. The most dangerous single moment of the most dangerous confrontation of the century was allowed to sink into the paperwork of both nations, waiting decades for someone with the patience to gather the fragments and understand what they added up to. Meanwhile, the world moved on, entirely unaware of how close it had come. The Cuban Missile Crisis was settled in the days that followed Black Saturday through negotiation at the highest levels, and it entered history as a triumph of nerve and statecraft. The lesson everyone drew was that leaders, pushed to the brink, had found the wisdom to step back. Almost no one knew that the true brink had not been in a capital city at all. It had been underwater, in the dark, in a decision made by an officer no historian had ever heard of. The years turned into decades. The Cold War ground on, and then, astonishingly, it ended. The Soviet Union that had built those submarines and sworn those crews to silence dissolved into history in the early 1990s. And with the old order gone, the sealed archives began, slowly, to crack open. The first light came from Russia itself. In the middle of the 1990s, a Russian journalist named Alexander Mozgovoy tracked down surviving members of the Foxtrot crews and published an account of what had happened beneath the Sargasso Sea, drawn largely from the recollections of Vadim Orlov. For the first time, the outline of the story reached print. The account displeased some of the old submariners who felt it cast their commanders in a poor light, and in October of 1997, at a small gathering in Moscow, marking the 35th anniversary of the crisis, Arkhipov himself rose to speak. It was the only public account he would ever give. 3 of the 4 captains were there to listen. Savitsky was not, for he had already died. Arkhipov described the voyage, the heat, the hammering, the surfacing, and the humiliation of the homecoming, and yet, careful to the last, he never once spoke the word nuclear. He would be dead within the year. On August 19, 1998, Vasily Arkhipov died of kidney cancer, an illness that those who knew him believed was rooted in the radiation he had taken aboard K-19 so long before. In a coincidence almost too strange to credit, the captain of K-19, Nikolai Zateyev, died just 9 days after him. Both men aged 72, both carrying the same invisible wound from the same reactor to their graves. The moment the wider world truly learned the truth can be fixed to a place and a date. In October of 2002, on the 40th anniversary of the crisis, an American research group called the National Security Archive, based at George Washington University, helped organize a conference in Havana that brought together surviving participants from every side: American, Soviet, and Cuban. There, in front of scholars and veterans and cameras, Vadim Orlov stood and told the story of what had happened in the deep. He described the heat, the barrels struck by sledgehammers, the captain's order to ready the special weapon, and the officer who had refused to go along. For the researchers in the room, it confirmed what fragments of documents and testimony had been suggesting for years. The director of the National Security Archive, a historian named Thomas Blanton, distilled the revelation into a single sentence that would race around the world. He said that a man named Arkhipov had saved the world. Robert McNamara, who had been the American Secretary of Defense during the crisis and who sat in that same room 40 years on, said plainly that the world had come far closer to nuclear war than anyone had understood at the time. But the man they were describing was not there to hear it. And this is where the story turns in a way no writer would dare invent. Vasily Arkhipov never knew that the world had learned his name. He never heard himself called the man who saved it. He had died 4 years before that conference, in obscurity, a private citizen of a country that no longer existed. His family later said he never regarded what he had done as heroism. To Arkhipov, it seemed, he had simply done his duty as he understood it, which was to keep his head when the men around him could not, and to refuse to make a mistake that could never be corrected. Honesty requires that we not flatten this story into a single triumphant line, because serious historians still argue over how to weigh it. The dramatic telling, the one captured in Blanton's famous sentence, holds that Arkhipov alone stood between the world and nuclear war. Some scholars have pushed back hard on that framing. They point out that the charges falling around B-59 really were signals rather than attacks, that a diesel boat with dead batteries and failing air might have been forced to the surface out of sheer necessity, even without the argument in the control room, and that the most vivid details rest on a single witness recalling events decades later. Even Blanton himself, in the years afterward, gently qualified his own words, noting that the crew's own account gave credit to more than one man for calming the boat. Others have answered that objection with force. A captain who has given the order to ready a nuclear weapon in the sincere belief that war has begun is a captain from whom only a deliberate act of refusal separates the world from catastrophe, and the fact that the boat was doomed to surface eventually does not change what might have happened in the minutes before it did. The most careful scholars have landed somewhere in the middle, concluding that the true danger lay in the combination of failing equipment, broken communications, and human exhaustion, a combination that genuinely put the use of a nuclear weapon on the table more than once during those days. What almost no one disputes is the core of it. On the most dangerous day of the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War, a nuclear-armed Soviet submarine, blind and battered and cut off from the world, moved toward using its weapon and did not, and Vasily Arkhipov was at the center of the reason why. The argument is over exactly how thin the margin was. It is not over whether the margin existed. It is worth stating plainly what was actually in the balance during those minutes in the control room, because the cold abstraction of nuclear war can hide its true meaning. By the autumn of 1962, the two superpowers together held tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, many of them far more powerful than the bombs that had ended the Second World War. A single torpedo detonating against an American fleet would almost certainly have drawn an American response against Soviet forces, and from there, the logic of escalation pointed in only one direction. Cities on both sides of the world stood within range of missiles and bombers held at the highest states of readiness. The most careful later estimates of what a full exchange would have meant run into the tens of millions of dead in the first hours alone, with far more to follow from the fallout, the ruin, and the hunger that would have come after. This was not a contest that anyone could win. It was a door that, once opened, could not be closed again. That is the true scale of what one exhausted officer in a sealed and sweltering compartment quietly refused to set in motion. He was not weighing a tactical exchange at sea. He was standing without ceremony and without witnesses in the doorway of the end of the modern world. The world did, in the end, find a way to say thank you, even though it came far too late for the man himself. In the year 2017, on the 55th anniversary of Black Saturday, an organization devoted to reducing the risks that could end human civilization created a new award to honor those whose actions had helped humanity avoid catastrophe, and the very first one was given in Arkipov's name. His daughter and his grandson traveled to London to accept it on his behalf, along with a prize of $50,000. At the ceremony, the physicist who led the organization offered a thought that captured the strange, enormous debt the living owe to the dead. He suggested that Arkhipov might be the single most important person in modern history, since it was because of him that the date being marked was an anniversary of survival and not the anniversary of a war. His daughter spoke of her father in the plainest possible terms. She said he had always believed he was simply doing his job, that he had never thought of himself as a hero, and that he had done what he did so that everyone could go on living on this planet. It was the same quiet modesty he had carried his whole life, spoken now by his child to a room full of people who owed him more than they could ever repay. So consider finally what this story actually asks us to believe, because the truth of it is stranger and more fragile than any legend. The Soviet military had built an entire philosophy around erasing the individual. It wanted components, not consciences. It trusted the system over the self, and that philosophy came within one man's refusal of destroying the very world it claimed to defend. The thing that kept the nuclear torpedo in its tube that night was not a machine. There was no clever safety lock engineered in a laboratory, no automatic failsafe that clicked into place at the critical moment. The only barrier between B-59 and catastrophe was a human being who was willing to think for himself inside a system designed to make thinking for oneself unnecessary. The mechanism did not save the world. The man inside the mechanism saved it by being precisely the kind of independent mind the mechanism had been built to eliminate. And that leaves us with a discomfort we would rather not sit with. The peace we inherited was not the reliable product of a well-designed process. It was the product of a coincidence of character, one steady man in one particular seat on one particular boat, at the exact moment when steadiness was the only thing that mattered. Change a single detail and the whole story comes apart. Had the command staff been split differently, had Arkhipov been placed aboard B4 or B36 or B130 instead, the third signature would never have been required, and 2 frightened men might well have been enough. On any of the other 3 boats, in that same nightmare of heat and fear and hammering steel, there would have been no third voice to say no. History balanced in the end on a roster decision that no one thought twice about when the boats left the Kola Peninsula. We prefer to believe that our survival rests on institutions and doctrines and safeguards. This story tells us that sometimes it rests on nothing more than whether one exhausted person, in an impossible moment, chooses to insist on the difference between what is feared and what is known. Vasily Arkhipov spent the rest of his days as an unremarkable presence to nearly everyone who met him. A competent officer, a modest man, a husband and a father who did not much like to talk about the sea. He carried the radiation of one disaster in his body and the memory of another in his mind, and he never asked to be called anything grander than what he was. The most consequential act of his life took place in total darkness, witnessed by a handful of men sworn to silence, recorded in no ceremony, honoured by no medal, and hidden from the world for 4 decades. He made the largest decision a person can make, and then he simply went home and lived, and the thing he prevented was so complete in its absence that it left no trace at all. That is the peculiar shape of what he did. The measure of his achievement is a war that did not happen, a light that never flashed over the Sargasso Sea, a chain of destruction that was never set in motion, an ending to the 20th century that never arrived. He is remembered at last for a catastrophe that is not there, and perhaps that is the rarest and truest kind of heroism there is. The kind that leaves nothing behind but the ordinary world, still turning, still full of people going quietly about their lives, almost none of whom will ever know how close it all came, or the name of the silent man who kept the sea from opening beneath them.